Hi, everyone, and welcome to Expo Online, your digital portal for Pacific Marine Expo on nationalfisherman.com. I'm your host, Jessica Hathaway, Editor-in-Chief of National Fisherman Magazine. As part of our ongoing conference and education series, today we will take a look at what's on the horizon in the offshore wind industry and how the permitting, siting, and research of those installations are affecting commercial fisheries and other U.S. maritime industries. Our moderator today is Kirk Moore, Associate Editor for National Fisherman, who's been covering the offshore wind industry for several years. Hi, Kirk.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for moderating today. And also joining us for our panel discussion today, we're very happy to have Annie Hawkins, the Executive Director of the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance in Washington, D.C. We've also got Mike Conroy, the Executive Director of the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations in San Francisco. And last but not least, we have Bonnie Brady, a recent National Fisherman Highliner. Congratulations, Bonnie. And Executive Director of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association in Montauk, New York. Welcome, everyone. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kirk.
Thanks a lot, Jess. I wanted to start off with everybody can just give a little bit about themselves and how they got involved in this issue, and they can give us a little bit of an overview about where their interests are coming from, what their concerns are. I was wondering if you could just, and we'll go to some questions and discussion after that. I was wondering if, Annie, if you can take the lead on that, tell us about your work and how you got involved with it.
Sure thing, and thanks, Jess and Kirk, for having us. This is a great event, and sorry to be online this year, but I'm happy to be part of the conversation. So as Jess said, I'm the Executive Director of RODA, the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance. I've been in this position for just over 2 years now, which is when we started RODA. And we are a national fisheries association. We've got about 175 members throughout New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Pacific Coast. And we actually formed originally on the East Coast because of the extreme level of concern and the lack of involvement in fishermen and offshore wind energy planning and development. We do work on other issues as well related to offshore development and fisheries, but really we spend the majority of our time working on offshore wind. We have two kind of platforms that we do that through. One is improving science with fisheries and offshore wind, and the other is improving communications and policy in the permitting process. So we take a strength in numbers approach. We find consensus positions amongst commercial fishermen, in some cases recreational fishermen as well, and bring those to policy forums, to direct work with developers, with regulatory community, to try to leverage everyone's voice and get fishermen better at the table with offshore wind.
Thanks, Annie. Next, Mike Conroy, can you tell us a little bit about your perspective from the West Coast?
Yeah, and thanks, Jess, for including us West Coasters on this panel. My name is Mike Conroy. I'm the Executive Director of the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. We represent 14 to 17 local port fishermen's marketing associations ranging from Santa Barbara up to beyond Northern California. I've been involved in tracking offshore wind since the call areas were announced off the California coast back in October of 2018. We joined RODA last year and are hoping and benefiting greatly from their experiences on the East Coast. We are about 2 years behind the East Coast in terms of our progress with regard to offshore wind and development. And like we saw on the East Coast, up until recently, we've been left completely out of the conversations. I'll give credit where credit is due. Our state, California, has started to do some more targeted outreach to fishing interests. I think it's helpful, but it doesn't seem that BOEM is piggybacking on that all that well. So we're still trying to jam our way to have a seat at that table, and looking forward to sharing what we've known and what still concerns us with the group here today. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Bonnie Brady.
Yes,
Long
sir.
Island Commercial Fishermen's Association has, for better or worse, the ringside seat for a lot of these big East Coast projects. So, Bonnie, can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved and how things were affecting your people?
Sure. Well, the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association represents all gear types of fishermen throughout Long Island. I started this process with offshore wind in 2001 when LIPA at the time, or actually it might have been Lilco, wanted to put 800 megawatts of wind south within 3 miles of Jones Beach. So we've been at it a very long time, and since then, since when the National Ocean Council was involved and we had Marco and they were talking about ocean zoning. It's been a push for a very long time, and I'm really glad to be with all of you in this group. It's really important for fishermen to basically lock arms and work together to communicate their needs before they get run over by these things on their traditional and historic fishing grounds.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. I have a bunch of questions just that came to mind for this, that based on what's been happening lately in the scene. Let me start off with a very general, obvious question up front. There are only a few weeks left until BOEM's scheduled release of findings from its Vineyard Wind Supplemental EIS and a cumulative impact study. Are you getting any sense of where the agency is going with this? And the American Wind Energy Association has been expressing confidence that they say Vineyard Wind is going to be able to move ahead when this report comes out. Do you get any signals about where this is going to go?
Who is that directed toward? Do you want me to take a bite at that first?
Yeah, I guess Bonnie first. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, kind of waiting with bated breath on there. We've tried very hard to make many of the issues regarding Vineyard Wind known, and ultimately so far we haven't apparently gotten any relief. I mean, we had a series of workshops. I know Rhoda specifically had workshops for transit lanes, which is a huge issue for us, and so far we haven't been able to get the Coast Guard, which is a cooperating agency but doesn't make the final call. BOEM does, and as far as we can tell, it doesn't appear that we are going to be given any relief. For Long Island fishermen, what that translates into is they will allow us to go from Montauk or Shinnecock east to go south of Nantucket to go squid fishing. But if those boats would then choose to go whiting fishing to the south, they'll have to take a 70 nautical mile jog around to come home, which is a real concern. No one at the present spacing wants to take the chance of going through, and the rope in a wheel could create a lot of problems, could kill people, frankly. So that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, Annie, you want to jump in on that about the direction that BOEM is going?
Sure. So, we really don't know any specifics. BOEM's treating this, as it should, that there was a public comment period, which is now closed. And so agencies typically don't interact with the public after that while they're doing their internal deliberation. So I'm not familiar with what OEA put out. I don't know if they know something we don't, but we certainly haven't heard anything from the fishing side about, where this may be going. We certainly are looking at Vineyard Wind as a potential of setting a lot of precedent for these projects, which I think is why you see that not only the affected fishermen that are fishing in the area of the Vineyard Wind project, but especially across the region and even all across the country, really submitted comments and are really looking to this project to see what the outcome is going to be. We know that there are a lot of substantive issues, like the ones Bonnie mentioned with the project, with transit, with impacts to the NIMP surveys, and so on and on. And I think we submitted a 50-page comment letter, so I won't get in all of those here. We certainly don't have enough time. But what we would really like to see is that, if the project does go forward, that those modifications, that any mitigation, that anything can be written into that project that would set the precedent for the future projects, or in case there's things that we don't know or can't know before whatever the first project would be, that there's plans in place to look at those things, like where we have questions about radar interference from modern generation turbines, right? That's something that you could do some desktop studies, but there's some extent to which, because we don't have those built anywhere in the world, you really do want to do those at-sea studies and look at those once they're built. And so what we've really been asking for from day one is, for anything that can be written in there, in terms of looking to that precedent, in terms of minimizing the impact of that project, but also setting up the other ones and the contiguous projects in that area to minimize those impacts. And then also to have a good plan in place for when we do start to see these commercial scale projects, that we know that we're learning as we go, that we know that we have baseline information and funding and resources and dedication to looking at what the impacts are, so that whatever they may be, whatever's found, we can work to better mitigate those and consider those in future projects.
Thanks, Annie. That kind of goes into another question I had about the 1 nautical mile spacing they proposed for off southern New England. Early on in this process, and I think Bonnie might remember a hearing that was in Newark, New Jersey a few years ago, and some of the 5th District Coast Guard people seemed to take a little more aggressive attitude towards potential conflicts back then. At one point, there was talk of a 5 nautical mile wide lane from Cape May to Montauk for ATV and tanker traffic, and we haven't heard much about that lately. I recall the developers, when they proposed 1 nautical mile, they said this shouldn't be a precedent for other regions, other reaches on the coast. How do you think that's going to hold up when we get farther south, close to major ports and more ship traffic?
Well, I also know with the New York Bight, they had talked about a 9 nautical mile for specific lanes, and those were added in new TSS lanes that they were talking about adding specifically because the huge panoply of wind energy areas within the Bight. I have not heard a thing since. One other thing for those people that are watching this, the Department of Energy has got a 4 or 5 part series. It's called the W-TRIM, Wind Turbine Radar Interference Mitigation Workshops that are online. And a lot of these issues, the things that were brought up in our transit meetings and in other workshops, as far as what Annie mentioned, radar interference, high frequency radar interference, which will affect the SAROPS of the Coast Guard itself. And one of the last webinars that was done, I think about 2 weeks ago, it made it very clear that the frequency radars are used for current height, and they use that when they are modeling if someone falls off a boat. And a difference in 1 meter of that height of the current at the time they fall off the boat with the weather involved could mean a larger 24-kilometer spread as to where they think someone who fell off did. And the radar that they have to use those, which are high frequency, will not work with the present radar system. And the folks that were in charge of the mitigation group specifically said at this thing that we have nothing. If we start now, we may have something, proof of concept in 5 years. So it's a real concern.
Yeah, and I would add to that that I know the Coast Guard has stated pretty consistently that all projects are different, and looking at transit needs and routing needs in different projects really does need to happen on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's very consistent with what folks that are fishing out there think. I mean, these projects are all different shapes and sizes. Some are adjacent to others, some are not, some are standalone. You've got one in New York Bight that's already between 2 shipping lanes. You've got areas where you have tanker traffic, where you have passenger vessel traffic, and ones where you don't. And so I think it does matter that you look at the specific traffic, the specific patterns, and then as well the size of the fishing boats, the density of the fishing boats, and also look at the traffic of the offshore wind construction and maintenance operations, and know that that's going to be changing. For the Massachusetts and Rhode Island port access route study, I think it's no secret that we disagreed with the methodology that the Coast Guard took to look at that, and the sort of robustness of those future predictions. They are certainly doing their own port access route studies in various regions and looking at them slightly differently from each other, which they should do. And we're hoping to continue working with the Coast Guard to improve those as we go in those other regions and look at what's there. But their take is sort of that looking at shipping traffic and those larger vessels is very, very different than looking at fishing vessels. And I'm just not sure that we currently have the data, the methodology, and the understanding in place to really look at how fishing vessels are moving, how they're transiting, and how that would change. And I really think that that's super key to get right, and to get right very, very soon. It should not have come to the level of disagreement that it did with that New England area, where you had universally everyone in the fishing industry saying we cannot transit there in 1 mile, and you had the Coast Guard coming out saying, well, it's just be more vigilant, drink more coffee. I mean, that's just not where we should be.
Yeah, and Kirk, if I can jump in here in terms of what's going on out here on the West Coast, we have intel that the Coast Guard is going to do a similar study out here for port access and route studies. We hope to draw from lessons learned from our friends on the East Coast, but we have to remember that what they're proposing to do off the West Coast is floating infrastructure. And that's going to add a much more level of complexity, because there are going to be cables running between the turbines that are going to feed into a junction box. So whereas the fixed facilities, cover a lot of ground. These are actually going to add additional complexity because these turbines are actually going to be in some way, shape, or form tethered together. And depending upon the depth at which those cables run, what impacts are those going to have? So it's a similar conversation, but it's also much different here on the West Coast. And I don't know, I think the uncertainty in the unknowns on the East Coast are even accentuated out here in terms of that type of infrastructure.
Mike, do you have any conception of, per turbine, how much bigger the footprint might be for these floating installations? Has anybody given you any guidance on that?
That's a great question, and it's one that we have asked. Theoretically, on the East Coast, you can operate between the turbines safely. Theoretically, I say. I don't know that theoretic operational safety exists on the West Coast. Given that these things are going to be tethered together, we don't know how deep the cables are going to run. There's going to be a lot of fishing operations that are just going to, it's going to be operationally impossible for them to function. So I think we're still, I think that the developers and the agencies involved are still trying to come to terms with exactly how this is going to go. And I think that there's a project proposed off Maine that is going to be using floating infrastructure, that they're actually planning on running the cables to the bottom and then burying them under the seafloor to run them and connect them. I don't think that's planned out here, because what they're planning out here is in much deeper water, over 2,000 feet of water at minimum. So it'll be interesting to see where this all comes out as we learn more about this. But as we've alluded to, all of us on this call, there's just so much unknown that it's hard to, it's hard to guess that which you can't even fathom to begin to guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there is information out there, right, about floating turbines and what the aspect ratio may be between the cabling and the turbine height. Like all turbines, fixed or floating, they're increasing in speed and capacity extremely quickly. I mean, every year they're just becoming much, much bigger and more efficient, which is a good thing in a lot of ways, but it also introduces a lot of unknowns, right, about what the environmental impacts will be, what the fishing interactions will be. And with floating, it's particularly difficult because we really don't have those commercial scale installations anywhere in the world that we can see what the interactions have been with fishing, whether with gears deployed or with fishing vessels transiting, and how those floating cables that may be floating and moving or may be buried under the ground, just depending on the site and the technology, how that really is going to interact. And so, we're putting together fact sheets on sort of the turbines themselves, but it's a very different question about what access will look like and what the potential snags and complications would be.
And Kirk, also just for note, for those that aren't really familiar, the majority of the sites in Europe, except for the project, I believe, in Hornsea that's in far deeper waters, those projects, you are not allowed to fish in them. They have been completely closed off to fishing. So now that they've built, I forget how many gigawatts, the Hornsea, that's supposed to be built in 4 slots, but a huge amount of European trips, I believe Europesh, which is an organization of like 17 countries and 2,500 boats, are all in an uproar because this is really the first time where many different countries' fishing fleets would be required to actually fish inside of them. So it's a whole new ball game, and they're pretty much, up until now, there's never been an issue. So they've come to this country and said, oh, we won't keep you from fishing in there. But many of us have had multiple conversations where either they won't, or the second somebody hits one, that insurance will just shut them down so that we can't.
That's right. And they're actually in some of those sites in Europe now, looking to open them up to fishing because they've covered so much of the fishing grounds with turbines. And that's, well, I don't know if I have an opinion whether that's good or bad, but certainly if you could think down the road that it's something that to accommodate fishing at all, that you would have to allow people access wind farms, you really do want to look at how to design that to make sure that fishing can happen within the project. And so in a lot of ways, we're shooting a little bit blind here with the specifics, especially the specifics of our fleets, but really looking at those design principles of how do you maximize that versus how do you just do what you want and then sort of see if the fisherman can fit in after, because certainly that's not what we want to be doing here.
And also, last thing, and then I'll shut up. The fishermen, for say in Denmark, that have been closed out of areas, they were compensated for being closed out of those areas. We have not, with the exception, at least I can speak to the project that's ongoing for the South Fork Wind Farm, they talk of compensation during the construction and or for gear related, but there's no type of compensation for a loss of grounds, which the Danish, I forget the name of the Danish fishing group, but I've got the document. I can send it to you if you want to include it with this, where they actively compensated them for loss of grounds and long-term loss of grounds.
That brings me to another question I've had in my mind too. And for a long time, I've heard people comment that the European-based wind developers seem to be handicapped by cultural differences between the governmental, regulatory, and legal framework in their home nations and the U.S. I mean, everybody's heard that, Jim Bennett from Boehm tell that story about the first time he sat down with these guys, and they said, "Well, you just keep the fishermen out." And Jim said, "That's not going to happen in this country." So, have you seen any evolution in that? Any changes that companies get more experience, hire more Americans? Has anything changed over the time with that?
I know, Kirk, you talked about the Newark meeting of the BITE, but prior to that, there was a meeting of the New York task force maybe the year before in Riverhead, and they had a fellow from either Sweden or Norway or Denmark, and they asked, well, how do you deal with the fishing and as far as in the fishermen? And it's like, well, we compensate them. And they're like, well, how do you do that? And he's like, it's part of our laws. So that is the piece of the puzzle that does not exist. Even the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act has specific information and a specific funding mechanism for oil and gas if you're down there and you drag and lose a net or something like that. But it was specifically for gear. There is no, when that was written, it was prior to any concept of offshore wind. So there's nothing in any language that would actually protect commercial fishermen with offshore wind that exists in this country to date.
And I think that all the developers are, we talk about them like they're monolithic, and they certainly are not. They have different approaches, and some have found better ways of working with fishermen than others. Some have strategies of hiring a lot of US-based staff, and some keep kind of lean staffs over here. There's probably pros and cons to both approaches. We could talk about some other time. But I don't know that it's an issue of them sort of not having enough people on the ground. They still do. I mean, like any big companies, I mean, most of these are legacy oil and gas companies or still oil and gas companies. They have real top-down management structures, right? And so the problem has seemed to evolve a little bit from not getting the right input and not talking to fishermen. They're certainly talking to fishermen. They're talking to fishermen a lot, most of them. But the question is what's being done with that information, where the decision's actually being made. Is that information going to who it needs to, and how much flexibility is there, and how much is this really top-down corporate decision-making that affects it? And so, one example that we've started coming across recently, which is a little bit newer because it's as things are evolving and we're getting closer to construction, is companies looking to hire U.S. vessels for fisheries research or potentially for crew transfers, guard vessel type work. That we haven't seen a lot of that, but that's something that certainly has been promised and folks are looking into. And we're seeing that they're bringing the very specific certifications over that are required in Europe and requiring U.S. vessels, even fishing vessels, to have those certifications to contract for the research projects. And that can be extremely complicated because even if you look at equivalencies and even if you look at various training, various safety things, skills, you may not have exactly what they have in Europe. And how much of a level of difficulty is it to incorporate those training programs? How much is that biasing maybe certain portions of the fleet or certain types of mariners over others to get those contracts? That's something that's been really a hot topic, particularly in the last few weeks or months, that a lot of people are looking into now that, at least for me, wasn't on my radar a year ago. So we keep sort of saying things like that are coming over from Europe and addressing them one by one. But a lot of it is because Bonnie, as Bonnie said, we don't have a lot of really strict laws here. We don't have a lot of prescriptions about how this is going to go. A lot of it's being decided by the states. We have, federal leadership at this point that's very deferential to the states, which in some ways is good because a lot of the impacts are local and, decentralization can be a good thing. But in this case, there's just so much lack of clarity in the regulations and in the process. And that's why it's sort of like looking at Vineyard Wind to see how this is going to go. rather than knowing how it's going to go as we would in something like fisheries management, because there it is in the regulations, right?
And if I can just jump in here and piggyback on something that Annie said, you know, one of our member associations is contracting with the state to add some additional clarity on important fishing grounds off Humboldt. Humboldt's one of the call areas off Northern California. There's been a lot of question, you know, with regard to the discreteness of the fisheries data that's available. And, you know, the Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association has contracted with the state to actually do some survey work to add clarity as to what areas are important and which aren't. Another point that Annie brought up is, you know, the folks, a potential developer in the Central California, off the Central California coast, actually reached out to fishermen in the local ports and harbors, both Morro Bay and Port San Luis. That was a great start. They neglected to look at the bigger picture and find out what, you know, what other fisheries operated in the area. And those participants in those fisheries weren't given the amount of outreach that was done to those local ports and harbors. And then we have, we're starting to see projects proposed within state waters, and the developers of those projects are also reaching out to the local fishing industry. I don't, you know, if it's a checking of the box exercise, because it was, you know, one email outreach, one webinar back in June, and there were promises of more, but we haven't heard anything else from them. So, you know, hopefully as we go further down the process, you know, these future groups will learn from these other groups and really involve the fishing industry at the outset.
Can I add one more thing also, Kirk, based on what Mike said? When these wind energy area leases were opened in 2014 and the Smart from the Start, the project that was occurring, I think it was the Vineyard Wind one, BOEM wasn't even aware of the concept of federal waters and that other states' fishermen fish there. I was the one that actually told them, wait a minute, you need to talk to Rhode Island, you need to talk to New Jersey, you need to talk to Massachusetts. There was never a blueprint. I mean, I've referred to it before as ready, you know, ready, shoot, aim, because there was never a blueprint going, okay, let's remove, everyone says, oh, well, you know, the ocean's a big place, you can go somewhere else. But a majority of fishing probably takes place in 10 to 20% of the ocean, depending upon the species, the gear type, et cetera. It wasn't as if we, you know, there was a deep dive environmentally and NIMS and NOAA said, okay, these are incredible areas of fishery importance, very important, very productive. We need to take these off the map first. They didn't do anything. They just went, wee, and leased away the ocean to foreign government-owned energy companies. At that point, we've been playing catch up, trying to not beg, borrow, or steal, but to beg our federal regulators to do something to put, you know, they had BOEM work through a best management practices. Let's go to fishing communities and talk to them about how it would work. The problem is you can say the word communicate all day long, but if I say to you, don't go here because it's important to 80% of our state's fleet, and then you go there anyway, it's not, we can talk. I had the representative for Vineyard Wind show up the day before, 2 days before Thanksgiving, say, oh, well, where do you guys fish? And I spoke about different areas and different fisheries. And it was just like, oh, well, no, we're you know, talking about it, but we'll be back and chat more. Like a week later, the cop was dropped. There was no forewarning. There was no idea of, can you leave, you know, take, these areas are extremely important. It didn't matter. We were just kind of the low man on the totem pole that they were hoping they could just scoot away by saying, oh, well, there's other places to go in the ocean.
There's a lot of talk down in Washington that the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act might be in for some changes, some action by Congress. The offshore operators down in the Gulf of Mexico, I know especially, are pushing for this in terms of their Jones Act interests.
Right.
Do you think there's an opening in there somewhere for the fishing industry to try to get in and get some advantage?
That was sent as a directive back when the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, someone helped me, maybe Annie, you might remember, I want to say when originally they had their workshop on offshore wind, I think it might have been 2014, 2015. And at that moment, the person that was in charge of doing the write-up looked for information, because that was specifically one of the directives that needed to be addressed prior to this all going into play. And didn't happen.
Yeah, and I actually think that that sort of came full circle back to your question, Kirk, about the cultures, in Europe versus here. And I do think that sort of cultural clash and missed communications is the name of the game here. I'm not sure. I think part of it is because of European companies, and I think part of it is just, there's been a lot of hollow communications, honestly. There's been a lot of lack of follow-up. And I think there's just very, very different types of people, very different types of perspective, very different information and knowledge going into it. I mean, it's still, this far down the road, I can still go to wind conferences and have consultants come up to me and say, but we really don't understand why fishermen don't like offshore wind. It makes artificial reefs, and artificial reefs are good, right? And like, yes, but it's not that simple. Yes, it's good if you plan them that way, if you design them that way, if you spend R&D and look into using the correct materials to do it that way, and you target the correct species that way, and there's so much to it. And I think there's a lot of people talking over each other's heads, and there's a lot of sort of incentive and sentiment that the industry should just be working it out. And there's a lot of ways that it's really, really difficult for the two industries to just work it out without any oversight, when you really do have directly competing interests. I mean, you've got one group of people with a primary financial incentive to do one thing, and another with a primary financial incentive to do another. And those two groups actually learning how to communicate and follow up and do that in meaningful ways that are not just more and more and more and more meetings. Because certainly we're hearing, especially from people that have these projects, these further along projects right in their back doors, the number of meetings for wind and the number of things they're asked to do and the time they're asked to spend on it is just, it's ludicrous. I mean, it's more than a full-time job, even if you weren't trying to also fish, right? So we really got to make a lot of improvements in this area.
Yeah. Let me just switch over to another question. We're starting to see some more fisheries science emerge that's funded by wind developers and BOEM, including some projects out of UMass Dartmouth that I've seen reports on. And just recently, a black sea bass and construction noise study that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center has started. How do you see these efforts going in terms of direction and adequacy? And I guess for Annie in particular, what has Rhoda and Rosa been doing on that front?
Sure, so I can start with that, and then maybe Bonnie and Mike can jump in a little bit on sort of the adequacy and how their perspective on that. So Rhoda just wrapped up 3 days of workshops for a project called Synthesis of the Science for offshore wind and fisheries interactions. And that's a joint project with NIMS and BOEM that we created under the Memorandum of Understanding that we have with the two agencies to improve science and science coordination. That the workshops kicked off the writing of a report that we're going to be doing through the winter with a target publication date of next summer. That looks at sort of what's known, what are information gaps, and getting input from folks from the fishing industry and others, of course, and trying to come up with a real better understanding of sort of where are we, what frameworks do we have, what methodologies do we have, what do we really not know anything about, what do we already have studies about, either ongoing or results from the US, from Europe, from Block Island, anything like that we can look at. So that's a cool project. And stay tuned for the results. The other thing that arose to the MOU was ROSA, as you referred to, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, which is a new organization that we created with NIMS, BOEM, states, offshore wind developers, that has its own executive director, its own website. So everyone interested should check out ROSA for sure. RODA is kind of a partner organization to ROSA, but it is a completely separate organization. And so ROSA's looking at coordinating, right now focused on the East Coast, looking at coordinating the regional science, making sure that results and studies that are being done are communicated, looking at synergies between data collection and how to get more bang for your buck with the studies that are ongoing, and whether those can be informative to things like fisheries, stock assessments, and so that we don't have just this series of one-off projects that are funded that just kind of sit on a shelf, right? Because there's way too many questions here to be that inefficient about it. And so Rosa's just getting up and running. They just had their first meeting of their advisory council, which includes you know, the federal agencies, the councils, the fishery management councils, that is, commercial and recreational fishermen, offshore wind developers in the states. So they will continue doing a lot of these things. They have a working group that's come out with interim guidance for fisheries monitoring, for project-specific fisheries monitoring plans for offshore wind projects. Because again, we were seeing each developer was coming up with its own fisheries monitoring plan. That's because they're required, or at least strongly encouraged to do so under BOEM's best management practices. But when you have developers spending money on these plans, it's good to know that information being collected in one can be applicable to the other, right? So you can start to look at regional effects. So I would say, you know, we're still really in the early days of the science coordination. We've also started working through ICES. In Europe, we've created a working group with researchers over there that are working on fisheries and offshore wind to get a better understanding and to better communicate what we do know in the studies that have been done. But yeah, definitely still a lot of questions. Yeah, I let Bonnie and Mike kick in with the specifics there.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Annie. And you're right. I think that the 3-day workshop that was just completed was stupidly informative. You know, I include quite a bit of West Coast folks who that was their initial introduction into the world of offshore wind, and the by and large the what I kept hearing was the bucket of stuff that we don't know vastly outweighs the bucket of stuff that we do know. And that's concerning for a lot of folks. And I appreciate, you know, the activities that have gone on with regard to studies of involving black sea bass. I know that out here on the West Coast, you know, there is a lot of concern with regards to impacts of the electromagnetic fields on salmon or other types of species. So I would hope and I would think that as we move forward with these projects off the West Coast, that's, you know, because salmon are culturally important up and down the West Coast, to both our fisheries, tribal fisheries, you know, the historic heritage of the states. So I would expect that there are similar studies done to ensure that the unintended consequences of these cables aren't impacts to salmon or any other of our the stocks or, you know, fish, crustaceans, and other things that we depend on, and protected species, marine mammals, seabirds, whatnot. I mean, it's all a bunch of unknown right
now. And I would just chime in. The science workshop that just went through was for Annie. Is that going to be on taped so that people can watch the whole thing later?
Yeah, we're already starting to upload the presentations to Rhoda's website, so that
I would highly advise anyone that has any desire in knowing about biology in the ocean and offshore wind to watch that, because it's amazing. The biggest problem, like Mike said, what we don't know, and you know, picking, even though Block Island Wind Farm, we're talking about 3 megawatt turbines compared to 14, 15 megawatt turbines. Things issuing with pile driving. The sound wave of pile driving is the same profile that can be a level B harassment or worse to whales, to marine mammals. With fish, if they've got swim bladders, it's a bad day, but also particle pressure, which Arthur Popper, who is a doctor of sounds and fishes, they a year ago decided that may have much more of an issue because the pile driving, which creates concussive waves of pressure, and how that would affect fish in all of its life stages. The EMF, whether it's salmonids on the West Coast or sand eels over by us, different species react different ways, but doing a practice test once the cord is already built is not necessarily, if you want to make sure that do no harm is your goal. I mean, in a perfect world, we should be doing tests right now over in Europe where they're actively putting these things in. And what Annie referred to as, oh, well, but it's artificial, and people do say this, it's artificial reef, that's good. Well, not if you're in a sand shoal migratory corridor where those species, their essential fish habitat depends on sand shoals, not changing of the ecosystem completely. And long-term studies of that where it doesn't become reef effect, where it's a giant aquarium, but it turns out there's like 2 or 3 species. You wind up with a lot of goby fish, but you won't have the fish that necessarily help and remain in the ecosystems of the area that we know and that the fishermen depend on. So there's so much work that needs to be done. And I mean, I'm looking forward to ICES, because in Europe, with the exception of the OSPAR studies that were started in 2000, 2002, and then went, and that's how I first learned about Dr. Andrew Gill and his work with EMF, that have gone, I think, for the last 12 years because they were required as part of the studies based upon the original wind farms that were done. We don't have anything really. You know, you can pinpoint and fish in a barrel and do a little bit of science here, but we need to have that big cumulative picture, which is why a lot of us in industry have advocated for a 5-year moratorium while we get the science right, while we get the surveys right, while we get to figure out what surveys we can change or do to save some sort of integrity of the survey system. And for all the other sequelae, the SAR-ops, the high frequency radars, the regular radar, heck, Homeland Security is involved too, but that's not, we're not talking about fish, but that's a real concern too.
Can I jump in with?
Interject briefly? Sorry, I don't want to interrupt anyone, but I just want to let everyone know that if you're watching this on nationalfisherman.com, we'll be providing links just below this video to the ROTA website where you can watch those conference sessions that they held at the end of October.
Thanks, Jess. And I would just kick on two more, I think, important things for research that didn't come up. One is, you know, is the research that's being done is really important, but the prioritization of the research is super important, and it's really important to make sure that fishermen, folks involved with the fishing industry, fisheries managers, fishery scientists are really heavily involved in that. And that's a big part of the concept of ROSA and why we worked so hard to help create that organization and make sure the fishermen are front and center at the table there, so that we can have these prioritization efforts, so that it doesn't feel like research is cherry picked towards something that may look like a positive, you know, artificial reef type effect, and maybe leave out some of these other things that are being identified as concerns of the folks that really have the ecological expertise, because they're out on the water every day and they're making predictions, right, that also need to be tested and that are super important. So hopefully these efforts that are getting set up, you know, anyone watching this with the fishing industry, definitely get involved, definitely jump in and let folks know, or contact us at ROTA, let us know, you know, what research is important to you, and we'll make sure that that gets passed along where it needs to. You know, and the other important thing, I think, I don't at all want to give short shrift to the projects the developers are funding, which are expensive and huge in a lot of cases, and as well as some of the states that are requiring significant investments in research. Like New York, for example, has just in its most recent solicitation required pretty substantial investments in fisheries and wildlife research for interactions, and these are all good things. But what we really don't have is any requirements for that, and what we don't have is any long-term funding for that coming from anywhere. So we have best management practices that, as permitting, you know, requirements or suggestions, the developers are encouraged to do these studies now. But what's going to happen after a project's built, right? What's going to happen when we have a lot of these and the permits are done? We don't have any federal funding going to NIMS to work on offshore wind at all. To date, we've never had anything get through appropriations there. There are, you know, certain service agreements between BOEM and NIMS, but there really isn't any long-term standing funding source to do this stuff. And this is a really, really, really huge problem. And so right now we're working with that developer funding to try to make sure that everybody's working together to figure out where that's best spent. But it's a long-term issue that we're all going to have to keep working on for sure.
I just want to say that is the problem. That is the #1 problem. If you cannot fund the scientific studies to make sure that we are not doing something that has irreparable harm for our futures and generations to come, I mean, that's the biggest, that's what we need to start with.
Thanks. One other thing, I mean, everybody looks at the impact of turbines on the fishing grounds. But another concern is cables. Mike touched on this. On the East Coast, on the shallow continental shelf, the developers are talking about plowing the cables down. I think 6 feet is the number I hear. What advice have surf clam operators offered on this? I can recall in the 1990s there was a whole slew of court cases involving telecom operators and clam boats, and I think there was a settlement that led to the practice today. Bonnie, what do you know about that?
Well, I'm not going to take on surf clams because I don't know. I know surf clammers that could answer that question. However, in the documents for the Block Island Wind Farm, and also in the stuff that's on the Department of Public Service website for New York for the South Fork Wind Farm, it is a target of 4 to 6 feet. That's a target. That is not a guarantee. And often they say, oh, only 1% or 5% of this will be buried on top. There is no requirement, however. And when they go, there's a 65-foot wide corridor that they use to jet plow, because you can only jet plow up to 6 feet with a jet plow. It won't go any deeper. Now, could you wind up horizontal directional drilling through the entire thing and go much deeper? Yes, except what does that include? Money. And that's the one thing that the developers don't want to spend that kind of money in order to be able to do just that. I know because I've been involved for quite a bit of time.
Just a moment.
Oh God, hold on, let me cancel that, sorry. But that's a huge problem. And now there's issues where they've been talking about, well, do we extend a cabling system throughout? Ambaric, I know, is trying to do that, versus a web of more cables of a much different variety. The telecommunication cables are very small and very thin. They don't have the same effect as some of these large kilovolt charged things that could literally, you know, flip a boat. The other issue is that those that say, well, no, we'll start and then down the road we'll have some sort of a network to do it. The thing is, though, that the systems that are going in place now are alternating current. And I found out from listening on the National League of Conservation Voter website webinar that they did, you can't plug AC into a DC East Coast wide cable in order to, they won't jive. So which comes first, the cable or the turbines? And there should be, this whole blueprint of how it's being done is piecemeal at best. And how many times do they have to screw up before in theory they get it right?
Yeah, that independent transmission question is a really important one, and definitely a conversation to watch here. It's certainly a chicken and the egg problem, right? Where if we have a whole lot of projects at the pace that we're looking at in this, what's anticipated by this bill that was introduced in Congress recently, and if we really see that scale of development and we have individual cable lines running from every project, it's just going to be a mess. And we've certainly heard from our colleagues in the UK that what they experience for access restrictions for fishing is way more due to the cables and the amount of cables in the water than it is to the turbines themselves. And so that's something we're obviously concerned about, to the extent to which regional transmission and coordinating that up front can reduce the amount of cable and the amount of structure in the water. That's a good thing. Of course, it's hard to plan for something when you don't know how much of it's coming, and I get that, but there is certainly more we could be doing to that end. With the clammers, I obviously not a cert clammer myself, but have had these conversations with them a lot. You know, I think obviously that's a gear that contacts the bottom and needs quite a bit of leeway to not, you know, that has more risk for snags in some ways. But really with them, it's the same concern as everyone else, which is that in a sense, it doesn't matter how deep the cable's buried, as long as it's deep enough that these EMF and heat impacts are accounted for, right? Which there's a lot of questions about. As long as it stays there, right? As long as it's deep enough that it's not going to be, you know, it's not going to interact with the gear and it stays where it is. And so the real key thing here is monitoring the cables and ensuring that they stay buried where they're supposed to be. And also there, you know, there's a lot of language about, you know, they have to be buried to 6 feet wherever that's possible, or along most of the route, or along 60, you know, at least 60% of the route. Well, what does that really mean when you start surveying and putting it in there? How do you really know? There's not a lot of transparency with how those routes are chosen. What we saw now going through the Vineyard Wind process and seeing a project go all the way through, there was never really a point in the public comments where it said, well, this is exactly where the cable is going to be. And hey, Fisherman, do you know anywhere better that we could run this cable to avoid some of these places where we can't bury it? With clam fishing, certainly it's happening on high energy sand bottom, a lot of shifting bottom, a lot of opportunity for things to come up there. And so those are really going to be the challenges, is making sure that it's initially set where it's supposed to be, that it stays where it's supposed to be, and that if it doesn't, that we know before there's an incident, right?
And to piggyback on that, you know, one of the things that we've seen out here is with the floating infrastructure, you know, planned to be located anywhere from 10 to 25 miles offshore, you know, that's going to impact certain fisheries. But where these cables transit through straight waters to get to the shoreside landing facility, that's going to impact other fisheries. And those other fisheries need to be cognizant of what's going on, because the last thing they want to see is some high voltage cable running through their grounds, especially if they're bottom trawlers or, you know, seiners that fish squid or sardines or mackerel or whatnot that opportunistically, you know, have bottom contact. But they need to be aware of that and follow it, not just think just because these things are 15 to 25 miles offshore, it's not going to impact my fishery. This could have profound impacts on their fisheries. They need to be paying attention to it.
And on that note, for every place, I think I have a document from Europe that talks about 80% of the insurance claims that are made are for exposed cables. There's a site called Kingfisher, and Jess, I'll get that to you, that has a huge listing of how many cables for how many projects throughout Europe which are exposed, how much are exposed, when there is an exposure. So if you're a fisherman and suddenly your grounds that you normally tow becomes exposed, because if it's on the ground to start with, they put cabling material, which is usually boulders and God knows what on top of it. So if you're a trawler, boom, your ground is gone. It has literally been taken from you. I know in Europe, they use a type of drift gill netting. And so they do actual studies before it happens and after to show that their nets can still move through it. But for guys that gill net in an area and suddenly they may lose their area for gill netting, or guys that whichever fishery they do. Block Island project, less than 1%, except they had 44 cases of mattressing. Now the mattresses are 3 feet high each. And what I've been told is they do 2 of them to make sure the cable stays down. Well, if you put a 6-foot cement wall on the ocean floor, you're no longer trawling in that area. And there is no compensation for that. There is nothing. So and there is no regulation that says if you can't keep it under the ground, or, you know, even if it is, if you're having to go through rock, you can horizontal directional drill through rock. That's something that has been done. It's called actually fracking, but they do it all the time. And so if that's not an issue, then find another pathway or make sure wherever you put it is where fishermen don't work. And we haven't had any oversight in that respect.
Yeah, that's true both with the location and the direction of the cable. I mean, obviously, you know, with mobile gear, it's directional towing, it matters, right? And so, and we tend to look at these things, even for us, we fall into the trap of like getting so worked up about the turbines and the project, and then, and the cables. And it's not just the transmission cables, it's also the inter-array cables. There's a lot of different ways that those could go between turbines. I mean, it's something that people certainly should pay attention to. And you know, with regard to them staying buried, the other issue certainly for processors and, you know, a lot of these big fishing companies, they're also huge consumers of power, right? And so there is a question, if a cable does become unburied and has to be reburied, who's paying for that? And it's not glib, right? It's not just fishermen saying, oh, haha, let's point out something that, you know, just to poke a hole in the project and just to complain about something. That can end up being a real cost to these, you know, particularly these processors and these bigger companies. So there are just really, really a lot of questions about that still.
And as far as in who's on the line for the Block Island project, that they were supposed to horizontal directional drill, and at the last minute after they got the approval, they decided to short horizontal directional drill instead. Now they're on the hook for ratepayers for a $30 million price tag as they spend an additional 6 months trying to rebury a cable, not only the one from Block Island to the project itself, but then one from Block Island all the way to Narragansett.
Well, and the question also is, you know, in terms of who's paying for that, is it getting passed on to the ratepayers, which is not necessarily our purview here, but also, I mean, as it regards fishing grounds and fishermen and access is, you know, what is the requirement when a cable is exposed? You know, not just what do they have to do, but in what time frame, and who do they have to warn? And is there, like Bonnie was saying, is there any compensation for that lost time if it is in an area that fishermen typically can fish, you know, and they lose half a season because the cable, or a full season if the cable is not buried in time or safely, appropriately, that what happens next? And I think that goes back to Annie's point about it being cultural. And I think that is also the theme that just keeps coming up in this conversation, is how much most people don't know about commercial fishing. They don't understand that an artificial reef might not be beneficial to commercial fishermen. They think commercial fishing and recreational fishing are essentially the same thing. And this is, just a national problem that we have with not knowing where our food comes from and not understanding different smaller industries, which the commercial fishing industry certainly is. And I think that's a big part of the educational piece in general, is like educating the American public and other industries about the commercial fishing industry. So we do need to start wrapping this up. I'm going to turn it back to Kirk for, pulling together some final thoughts, and then we're going to close this out. So go ahead, Kirk.
Thanks, Jess. Well, this has been really terrific, very enlightening. Thank you all. I just wanted to go around, start with Annie and Mike and Bonnie, and just what final thoughts you have. Feel free to throw out anything you think we've missed.
Oh, it's a broad question. Certainly, there's a lot that there's always more you could talk about. But I think this has been great, and I think your questions really were the right ones and most pertinent ones. Certainly, between now and the end of the year, things are going to keep changing, keep evolving, and I would just say, to anyone in the industry, get involved and stay involved. We're constantly improving Rhoda's website and our reach, and so if you're not involved with Rhoda, be great. But whatever works, and really start to get educated and start to learn how these things are going. It's probably it's probably coming to to your fishing grounds and somewhere near you, and so it's certainly never too early to start understanding the process and understanding how you can get involved and make sure that you're as represented as you can be.
Yeah, just echo exactly what Annie said. We have sort of a malaise out here that people seem to have this belief that no, offshore wind's not coming. It's the shiny penny on the ground that everybody's fighting over, but they're finally going to realize that the penny isn't as shiny as they think it is. I implore folks on the West Coast to pay attention to what's going on. There are BOEM Oregon task forces, BOEM California. Yeah, be aware, get informed, join Rhoda. Plug Annie. We need to be more vocal. The louder we are, the more we get invited to participate. Push the council to get involved. Push the region to get involved. There's just a lot of tentacles that are popping up off all this, and if we're unified in our approach in terms of what we're asking for, better science, more knowns than unknowns, then I think we can have success in minimizing, to the extent possible, impacts to our fisheries.
Yes, and yes, and oh gosh, everyone that's part of an association, they need to become extremely aware of what's going on, not only within their associations, find out where there are areas of fishing that are important to them. I would say to every single boat between here and the West Coast, join Rhoda. They will pick you off one by one if they can. If we are united as a group on all coasts, and then if of course we become united with our European brethren who are also doing this, we may stand a chance. We have to educate our congressmen, we have to educate our legislators, we have to be able to, as a group, say, stop the process and fix it before it goes further, because as humans, we've never done anything wrong, and let's just see what happens. I mean, if we haven't learned from that lesson before, we should learn it now. And it isn't just fishermen, and it's not just ports, it's all the infrastructure businesses, it's everyone, it's the processors, it's anyone, it's consumers. They all need to be able to get involved in a way that will go past communication to where people actually, in places of authority, whether it's BOEM or any of the other regulatory bodies, start to listen and give us a fair seat at the table. That's it.
Okay, thank you all.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks Annie, Mike, and Bonnie, and thank you so much Kirk for leading us all in this discussion. Thanks for joining us for Expo Online on nationalfisherman.com.
Thank you.